The trench smelled like death had taken up permanent residence. Not the sharp, sudden death of a bullet through the chest, but the slow, rotting kind that settled into the wood planks and earthen walls that clung to every uniform and every breath. Private James Henry Cobb pressed his back against the cold mud wall, his fingers wrapped around something the German soldiers across no man's land had never seen before. A Winchester Model 1897 pump-action shotgun, its barrel sawed short for trench work, its wooden stock already darkened by the dampness of the Argonne Forest in late October 1918. The weapon felt wrong in his hands, not because of its weight or balance, but because it belonged to a different world entirely. This was a tool for hunting quail in the Alabama pine woods, for protecting farmsteads from coyotes, for the kind of close-quarters work that happened in mining camps and railroad towns. It had no business in the mechanical hell of the Western Front, where death came from artillery shells you never saw, and machine gun fire that turned men into red mist before they'd taken 3 steps into the open. But someone in Washington had decided otherwise. Someone had looked at the nightmare of trench warfare, the twisting communication trenches, the sudden corners, the brutal raids in darkness where men killed each other with sharpened shovels and bare hands, and thought, we need something that turns corners better than a rifle. Something that doesn't require aim when you're face to face with an enemy in the dark. Something that makes a man's insides into outsides before he can stick you with a bayonet. James had arrived at the front 3 weeks ago with 12 other men from his training battalion, each of them carrying one of these peculiar weapons and a canvas bag of shells. The other soldiers in the 77th Division had looked at them like they were carrying fishing poles to a knife fight. The French poilus in the adjacent trench had laughed openly, making jokes James couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. Even their own sergeant, a hard-eyed career soldier named Dutch Keller, who'd been in France since 1917, had shaken his head when he saw them. "Shotguns," Dutch had muttered, spitting tobacco juice into the mud. "Next they'll send us slingshots and tell us to make do." But that was before the night raid 2 weeks ago. That was before James and his squad had been sent into the German trenches to capture prisoners for interrogation, sliding through the wire in the darkness with their faces painted black with boot polish, and discovered what these weapons could do when the fighting got so close you could smell the fear on the other man's breath. James closed his eyes now, trying not to remember the sound, the pump action's distinctive clack-clack as he'd cycled the next shell into the chamber, the way the first German soldier had simply ceased to exist from the chest up when James fired at a distance of maybe 8 feet in the narrow confines of their trench. The screaming that came after, not from the dead man, but from his companions, a kind of screaming James had never heard before. Terror mixed with outrage, as if he'd broken some unspoken rule of war. They'd captured 3 prisoners that night. All 3 had stared at James's shotgun with something beyond fear in their eyes. One of them, a young man who couldn't have been more than 19, had actually started crying when he saw it, backing away even though his hands were already bound. The German prisoners had been taken to division headquarters for interrogation. James and his squad had returned to their section of the line as the sun came up, and that's when the rumor started spreading. The rumor that would lead to this moment, huddled in this trench, waiting for something none of them quite understood. Corporal Eddie Marchetti sat next to James, cleaning his own shotgun with a piece of cloth that had long since stopped being clean. Eddie was from Philadelphia, the son of Italian immigrants, and he treated his weapon like it was a fine musical instrument rather than a tool for killing. He had been a skeet shooter before the war, had won competitions up and down the eastern seaboard, and he moved with the shotgun like it was an extension of his body. "You hear what Lieutenant Pierce said?" Eddie asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the distant rumble of artillery. "He said the Germans are calling us something. Ein Namen, a name." "What name?" James asked, though part of him didn't want to know. Grabschander means grave robbers or something like that, or maybe grave defilers. The translator wasn't sure. Eddie's hands kept moving, checking the action, making sure no mud had gotten into the mechanism. "The prisoners we took, they told the interrogators that their officers are saying we're using illegal weapons, that shotguns violate the rules of war."
James almost laughed, but the sound died in his throat. Rules of war. As if the gas that had burned out the lungs of the British at Ypres followed rules. As if the flamethrowers that turned men into human torches respected some gentleman's agreement. As if the artillery barrages that could bury entire squads alive in collapsed dugouts gave a damn about the Hague Convention. But he understood what Eddie was really saying. The Germans weren't just scared of the shotguns, they were angry about them, and angry enemies did unpredictable things. Private Thomas Rabbit Warren sat on Eddie's other side, his shotgun resting across his knees. Rabbit was 18 years old, the youngest in their squad, and he'd gotten his nickname because of the way he'd frozen during their first artillery barrage, paralyzed like a cottontail in a spotlight. He was from rural Tennessee, from a holler so deep in the mountains that he'd never seen a telephone or an automobile before joining the army. But he'd grown up hunting, and with a shotgun in his hands, he moved like water. "My daddy always said," Rabbit spoke slowly, his accent so thick it took a moment to parse his words, "that a man who complains about the tool you use to beat him is just mad he didn't think of it first." Eddie snorted. "Your daddy sounds like a philosopher." "My daddy couldn't read," Rabbit replied without shame, "but he knew fightin'." Sergeant Dutch Keller appeared at the end of their section of trench, moving in a crouch despite the high walls protecting them from direct fire. Dutch was from Michigan, had worked in the copper mines before the war, and he had the build of a man who'd spent his life doing hard labor, thick shoulders, hands like mallets, a neck that seemed to connect directly to his torso without bothering with the formality of being narrower than his head. "Listen up," Dutch said, his voice carrying that particular quality that made men pay attention without him having to shout. "Lieutenant Pierce just got word from battalion. The Germans have filed an official complaint through neutral channels, Switzerland or somebody. They're saying our shotguns are inhumane weapons and demanding we stop using them." "And?" Eddie asked. "And command told them to go to hell." Dutch smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "But here's the thing. The prisoners we took, they're saying their officers are offering bounties. Any German soldier who kills one of us shotgun boys gets an extra week's leave and double rations. Any soldier who captures one of these weapons intact gets a medal and a month in Berlin." James felt something cold settle in his stomach. It wasn't fear exactly. He'd been afraid before, had learned to live with it like a constant companion. This was something different. This was the knowledge that he and his squad weren't just soldiers anymore. They were targets. They were prizes. "There's more," Dutch continued, and his expression darkened. "Intel says the Germans are planning something, a big raid, maybe in the next few days. They want to hit our line hard, grab prisoners, and specifically, they want to grab our shotguns and anyone who knows how to use them. They want to make an example." The trench went quiet except for the usual sounds, the distant pop of rifle fire, the creak of duck boards under men's feet, the skitter of rats in the darkness. James looked at his shotgun, really looked at it, and wondered what it said about the world that this particular piece of metal and wood had become so important. "Why?" Rabbit asked, his young voice cutting through the silence. "Why do they care so much? A bullet's a bullet, ain't it? Dead's dead." Dutch squatted down, bringing himself to eye level with the younger soldier. "Because, kid," he said, "when you shoot a man with a rifle, you might kill him clean. One bullet, maybe through the heart or head, and he's gone. But these things," he gestured at the shotguns, "these things put 9 lead balls into a man at once. At close range, they don't just kill, they erase. They turn a human being into meat. And more than that, they do it in the place where the Germans thought they were safest, in their own trenches, in their own fortifications. We brought a wolf into their den, and wolves don't follow the rules of civilization." James thought about the German soldier he'd shot during the raid, how the man had been reaching for his rifle 1 second and had simply stopped existing the next, how there had been nothing to do for him, no last words, no chance to write a letter home, just there, then not there, like a candle blown out. "So what do we do?" Eddie asked. We stay sharp. We keep these weapons close, and when they come, because they will come, we show them exactly why we brought these things to their war." A runner appeared at the far end of the trench, a young private whose face was streaked with mud. He spotted Dutch and hurried over, pressing a folded piece of paper into the sergeant's hand. Dutch read it quickly, his jaw tightening. "What is it?" James asked. He looked up at them, and in his eyes, James saw something he'd never seen before in the hard old sergeant: uncertainty. "The Germans just executed one of our men. Captured him in a raid last night near Verdun. They say he was carrying a shotgun. They hanged him in sight of our lines. Left a sign in English: 'The fate of all who bear illegal arms.'" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rats seemed to stop moving. "They can't do that," Rabbit whispered. "Can they? There's rules about prisoners." "There are rules," Dutch agreed. "And then there's what happens when men decide the rules don't apply anymore."
James looked down at his shotgun again, at the weapon that had seemed so strange just weeks ago, and now felt as natural in his hands as breathing. He thought about the man who'd been hanged, wondered if he'd known what was coming, wondered if he'd regretted carrying this particular weapon into this particular hell. The air in the trench seemed to thicken, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Somewhere in the distance a flare went up, painting the sky a sickly green before falling back to earth and leaving the darkness deeper than before. "How long?" Eddie asked quietly. "How long do we have before they come for us?" Dutch folded the paper and tucked it into his jacket. "Could be tonight, could be next week, but they're coming. Intel says they're massing troops in the sectors across from us. Fresh soldiers, stormtroopers from the Eastern Front, men who know how to raid trenches. They're not coming to take territory. They're coming for us specifically, for these weapons, to prove a point." James felt the cold mud seeping through his uniform, felt the weight of the shotgun across his lap, felt the presence of his squad mates around him. Eddie with his precise, methodical movements, Rabbit with his mountain-born instincts, Dutch with his mine-hardened determination. There were 12 men in total, 12 shotgun specialists spread across this section of trench, mixed in with the regular rifle companies. 12 men who'd suddenly become the most wanted soldiers on the Western Front. "There's something else," Dutch said, his voice dropping even lower. "Command wants us to write letters tonight, just in case." No one asked what just in case meant. They all knew. As night fell over the Argonne Forest, James Henry Cobb sat in a shallow dugout carved into the trench wall, a stub of pencil in one hand and a piece of damp paper on his knee, trying to find words to send back to Alabama, trying to explain to his mother and father and younger sister why he'd joined up, why he'd volunteered for this special weapons squad, why he might not be coming home. But the words wouldn't come. How could he explain that he'd wanted to make a difference, to be part of something larger than himself? How could he make them understand that carrying this strange weapon had given him a purpose in a war that seemed otherwise purposeless, where men died over yards of muddy ground that would be lost and retaken a dozen times? In the end, he wrote only, "I am well. The food is bad but filling. I think of home every day. Give my love to everyone. Your son, James." It wasn't enough. It wasn't close to enough. But it was all he had. Somewhere across no man's land, in trenches identical to his own, except for the color of the uniforms, German soldiers were preparing for a raid. They were checking their weapons, sharpening their knives, painting their faces. They were being told about the American devils with their spreading guns, about the dishonor of such weapons, about the glory that awaited anyone who brought one back as a trophy. And somewhere in those German trenches, an officer was planning how to break the American line, how to reach those 12 special soldiers, how to make an example that would echo through every trench from the Channel to the Swiss border. James didn't know any of this specifically, but he could feel it. A tension in the air like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. The war had been going on for 4 years before America entered, had ground millions of men into the mud, had introduced horrors that would have been unimaginable just a decade before. Gas, tanks, aerial bombardment, the machine gun's industrial efficiency at killing. And now shotguns had become the weapon that broke the unwritten covenant, the tool that made professional soldiers recoil in disgust. It said something about the madness of it all, James thought, that men could stand knee-deep in corpses, could watch their friends choke on gas, could witness the aftermath of flamethrower attacks, and still draw a line somewhere and say, "But not that, not shotguns. That's too much." The night deepened. Somewhere a machine gun opened up, firing blind into the darkness, a nervous sentry or a random harassment, impossible to tell. The bullets cracked overhead like someone breaking sticks, and James ducked instinctively even though he was well below the parapet. Eddie appeared at the entrance to the dugout, his face ghostly in the darkness. "Dutch wants us all together. He's got something to say." James followed him through the twisting communication trench to a wider section where their full squad had gathered. 12 men with 12 shotguns, plus Dutch with his standard issue rifle. They huddled in a rough circle, close enough to hear each other over the background noise of war. "I want to tell you something," Dutch began, his voice rough but steady. "Something they didn't teach us in training. When the Germans come, and they will come, they're not going to fight like you expect. They're going to come fast, in the dark, with grenades and knives and clubs. They're going to try to overwhelm you before you can use those weapons effectively."
He paused, looking at each of them in turn. "So here's what you need to remember. These shotguns, they're not just weapons. They're psychological tools. The Germans are afraid of them, truly afraid. In a way, they're not afraid of rifles or bayonets. That fear is your ally. The sound of a pump-action cycling in the dark, that'll freeze a man for a split second. The spread pattern means you don't need perfect aim. And the damage they do, that'll make the men behind the first wave hesitate. But," Dutch continued, "you need to be smart. Don't empty your weapon on the first targets. Save shells for the rush that comes after. Keep moving. Don't let them pin you in one spot. And most important, watch each other's backs. They want to isolate us, pick us off one by one. We stay together, we have a chance." Rabbit raised his hand like he was in school. "Sarge, what if they capture us?" The question hung in the air. Everyone was thinking about the hanged soldier, about the sign left in English, about the message the Germans were trying to send. "Then you make them regret it," Dutch said simply. "You fight like hell, and if that's not enough, you remember you're a soldier of the United States Army, and you conduct yourself accordingly. They want to break us, to make us ashamed of these weapons. Don't give them that satisfaction." James felt something shift inside him. Not courage exactly. Courage was too clean a word for what he felt. It was more like resignation mixed with determination. A sense that he'd been moving toward this moment since the day he'd enlisted, since the day he'd first wrapped his fingers around this peculiar weapon, since the first time he'd seen what it could do to human flesh. The gathering broke up, men returning to their positions, checking weapons one more time, trying to snatch what sleep they could in the hours before dawn. James returned to his section of trench, wrapped himself in a thin blanket that did nothing to keep out the cold, and tried to rest. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, his mind kept turning over Dutch's words, kept circling back to the fundamental strangeness of his situation. He was 19 years old, from a small town in Alabama where the biggest excitement was usually the county fair. 6 months ago, his greatest concern had been whether to take over his father's hardware store or try his luck in Birmingham. Now he was sitting in a mud hole in France, holding a weapon that had made him famous and infamous in equal measure, waiting for an enemy that wanted to kill him not just because he was American, but because of the specific way he might kill them first. The philosophy of it made his head hurt, or maybe that was just exhaustion. James Henry Cobb had learned to measure time differently since arriving in France. Not by hours or days, but by the spaces between artillery barrages, by the cycles of trench rotation, by the number of cigarettes he could smoke before his fingers went numb in the cold. The rhythms of war had replaced the rhythms of civilian life so completely that sometimes late at night he struggled to remember what peace felt like. Before the war, before the trenches, before the shotgun that now defined his existence, James had been ordinary in the best possible way. He'd grown up in Oakwood, Alabama, a town of maybe 800 souls if you counted the farmers who came in on Saturdays. His father, Henry James Cobb Sr., ran a hardware store on Main Street, a narrow brick building that smelled perpetually of motor oil and fresh-cut lumber. His mother, Sarah, taught piano lessons in their front parlor and sang in the church choir with a voice that could make hardened loggers weep during hymns. James had been raised with clear expectations. Graduate from high school, he'd been one of only 7 students in his class to do so. Work in the store, learning the business from floor sweeping to bookkeeping. Eventually marry a nice local girl. There'd been hints about Amanda Fletcher, the banker's daughter, who'd smiled at him after services more than once. Take over when his father got too old to manage the accounts and the inventory. Raise children who would, in turn, learn to distinguish between a Phillips head and a flathead before they could read. It was a good life, stable and predictable, and James had wanted to scream every single day. Not because he hated Oakwood or his family or the hardware store. He loved them all fiercely, in the way you love things you've never known life without. But there was something in him, some restless hunger that had no name, that looked at the progression of days stretching ahead like identical fence posts and felt suffocated. He'd read books borrowed from the traveling library, stories of adventure and distant places. He'd stared at maps tacked on the schoolhouse wall, tracing coastlines of countries he couldn't pronounce. He'd listened to veterans of the Spanish-American War spinning tales in front of the barber shop and felt a dangerous envy. When war broke out in Europe in 1914, James was 14 years old. The names of battles, Mons, the Marne, Ypres, seemed as exotic and distant as myths. When the Lusitania sank in 1915, his father had shaken his head over the newspaper and said, "Mark my words, this'll drag us in eventually." But eventually seemed like a long time when you were 15, and Alabama felt like the entire world. Then came April 1917. America entered the war, and suddenly Oakwood erupted with flags and recruiting posters and a fever that swept through the young men like influenza. James was 17, still technically too young, but working in the hardware store had made him strong, had put muscle on his frame earlier than most boys. When he turned 18 that July, he walked into the recruiting office in Montgomery without telling his parents. He could still remember his mother's face when he came home in his new uniform 2 weeks later, having passed his physical and signed his papers. She'd gone pale, had gripped the back of a chair like the floor was tilting beneath her feet. His father had just looked at him for a long moment, then turned away. His sister Emma, 12 years old and full of patriotic fervor, absorbed from her teachers, had hugged him and said he looked like a hero. He hadn't felt like a hero. He'd felt terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, like he'd jumped off a cliff and was in the moment before gravity took hold.
Basic training at Camp Wheeler in Georgia had been brutal. The sergeants had treated them like children playing at soldier, had broken them down and built them back up into something harder. James had learned to march until his feet bled, to shoot until his shoulder was one massive bruise from the rifle's recoil, to follow orders without hesitation, even when those orders seemed designed purely to humiliate. But he'd also found something he hadn't expected. He was good at it. Good at the discipline, good at the physical demands, good at shutting off the part of his brain that asked questions and just executing. When they'd asked for volunteers for specialized training with new weapons technologies, he'd stepped forward without hesitation. That's how he'd ended up with the shotgun. The training had been conducted by a Marine gunnery sergeant named O'Malley, a man who'd seen action in Nicaragua and spoke about close combat like other men discussed woodworking.
O'Malley had been the first person to explain to James that warfare was changing, that the trenches of Europe had created a new kind of fighting that required new kinds of tools. A rifle's a precision instrument, O'Malley had told him, standing in front of a mock-up trench system in the Georgia woods. You aim, you fire, you hit what you're aiming at. Maybe. But in a trench, in the dark, with a man coming at you with a bayonet while shells are exploding and gas is drifting and you can't see 3 feet in front of your face, precision's worthless. What you need is coverage. What you need is something that says everything in this direction stops existing right now. He'd handed James a Winchester Model 1897, and the weapon had felt immediately foreign. Too short for a rifle, too long for a pistol. The pump action seemed crude compared to the bolt-action Springfield he'd trained with. But when O'Malley let them fire at targets, man-shaped silhouettes set up at varying distances and confined spaces, James had understood. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. At 15 feet, a single shotgun blast had shredded 3 targets standing in a group. At 25 feet, the spread pattern had been wide enough to hit 2 men standing several feet apart. And the sound, that distinctive boom followed by the mechanical clack-clack of the pump action, it was unmistakable, authoritative, final. The Germans call it a trench broom because it clears a trench like you're sweeping out dirt, O'Malley had said with grim satisfaction. They'd trained for 6 weeks with the shotguns, learning to reload by feel in total darkness, learning to clear jams with numb fingers, learning to move through confined spaces while keeping the weapon ready. James had discovered he had a natural aptitude for it. His years helping his father in the hardware store had given him good hands, steady, precise when they needed to be, strong when force was required. The shotgun became an extension of him faster than the rifle ever had. Then they'd shipped out, crossing the Atlantic in a converted passenger liner packed so full of soldiers that they'd slept in shifts, 2 men to a bunk. James had spent the crossing trying not to think about U-boats, trying not to remember that the last time he'd seen water this vast had been a school trip to Mobile Bay, and that had seemed impossibly huge at the time. France had been a shock. He didn't know what he expected. Something from the magazines, perhaps. Noble French soldiers, grateful civilians, a sense of crusade and purpose. Instead, he'd found exhaustion. The French troops they'd marched past looked at them with eyes that had seen too much and believed in too little. The civilians in the towns behind the lines went about their business with grim efficiency, barely acknowledging the Americans. And the landscape itself seemed diseased, the trees shattered and the earth poisoned. His first week in the trenches had been spent just learning to survive, learning which sounds meant incoming artillery and which were outgoing, learning to identify gas by smell before the alarms went up, chlorine like bleach, phosgene like cut grass, mustard like garlic, learning to sleep in snatches while standing up, while sitting in mud, while pressed against a cold wall with rats running across your legs, learning to eat food that tasted like metal from the cans, to drink water that always seemed to carry a faint taste of decay no matter how many purification tablets they used. Learning to kill. That had been the hardest adjustment, though he'd never have admitted it to the other men. In training, they'd fired at targets, paper silhouettes, wooden mock-ups. In the trenches, the first time James had fired his shotgun in anger, it had been at a German soldier who'd appeared around a corner during a trench raid, his face streaked with mud and his eyes wide with the same surprise James felt.
James had fired without thinking, pure reflex, and the man had ceased to exist. Not died, ceased to exist. 1 second a human being, the next just gone. And James had stood there, his ears ringing from the shot, staring at the space where the man had been, and felt his stomach rebel. He'd vomited into the mud, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his weapon. Eddie had found him like that, had pulled him into a dark corner and let him shake and retch until nothing came up but bile. "First one's always the hardest," Eddie had said quietly. "After that, it gets easier." But it hadn't gotten easier for James. It had gotten different. The second time he'd killed a man,
during that night raid that had started all this trouble, he'd felt a distant sorrow rather than horror. The third time, nothing at all. And that absence of feeling scared him more than the initial shock had. What did it mean that he could end a life and feel nothing? What did it say about him that he could pump the action on his shotgun and fire again without hesitation? Could see the destruction his weapon caused and simply move to the next target? In the quiet moments, and there were quiet moments, hours of waiting that stretched between seconds of terror, James tried to hold on to who he'd been before. He wrote letters home that were carefully edited versions of the truth. He told his mother about the French countryside, leaving out the shell craters and the poison. He told his father about the other soldiers he'd met, leaving out the ones who died. He told his sister about the interesting differences between European and American culture, leaving out literally everything that mattered. He carried a photograph in his breast pocket, one of the whole family taken outside the hardware store the day before he'd left for basic training. In it, his mother was smiling with visible effort. His father stood straight-backed and proud. Emma grinned with all the innocence of 12 years. And James himself looked impossibly young, his uniform still crisp and new, his face unmarked by the knowledge of what a shotgun could do to human flesh at close range. Sometimes, late at night, he would take out that photograph and stare at it by the light of a shielded candle, trying to remember what it felt like to be that boy, trying to convince himself that boy still existed somewhere inside the man who could kill without feeling. The other soldiers in his squad became his anchors to something resembling normalcy. Eddie Marchetti, with his careful hands and his stories about skeet shooting competitions where the biggest stakes were bragging rights and maybe a trophy. Eddie had a girlfriend back in Philadelphia, a girl named Rosa who wrote him letters 3 times a week, letters he read and reread until they fell apart at the creases. He kept her picture in a waterproof pouch and showed it to anyone who'd look. A pretty girl with dark hair and a smile that made even the other soldiers feel a little less alone. "When this is over," Eddie would say, cleaning his shotgun with the same tender care other men reserved for love letters, "I'm gonna marry her. Big wedding, Catholic church, the whole thing. And then I'm never gonna pick up another gun as long as I live. Maybe I'll become a florist or something. Something gentle." Rabbit Warren, despite his nickname and his initial paralysis, had turned out to be one of the steadiest soldiers in the squad. He came from a place even more isolated than James's hometown, a holler in the Tennessee mountains where his family had lived for 5 generations, barely touching the modern world. He'd never finished school because there was no school to finish, had learned everything he knew from his father and grandfather and the rhythm of the seasons. "I ain't much different from hunting," Rabbit had said once. His accent was so thick, James had to parse each word individually. "Something's trying to kill you, you kill it first. Only difference is, deer don't shoot back." But at night, when he thought no one was watching, Rabbit would carve small figures from scrap wood with a pocket knife. Bears and deer and birds, creatures from his mountain home. He'd leave them in odd places around the trench, small wooden sentinels standing guard over the mud and misery. James had found one in his dugout once, a tiny carved rabbit that fit in his palm. He still carried it, a strange totem against the darkness. There was Private Gene Holloway, a black soldier from Mississippi who joined the army to escape sharecropping and instead found a different kind of imprisonment. The army was segregated, but the shotgun specialists were short on men, and Gene had qualified with scores that couldn't be ignored. So he ended up in their mostly white squad, and James had watched with quiet shame as some of the other soldiers treated him like he didn't belong. But Gene was the best shot among them. He had a gift for judging distances in the dark, for knowing exactly when to fire and when to wait.
Once, during an artillery barrage that had buried part of their trench, Gene had dug for 20 minutes straight to reach a trapped soldier. Never hurrying, never stopping, just methodically moving earth until the man was free. My granddaddy was born a slave, worked cotton his whole life, died when he was 46, used up. My daddy told me, don't let nobody use you up. Don't matter what you're doing, find something you're good at and be so good they can't ignore you. He patted his shotgun. Guess I found my thing. There was Private Henry Liu, son of Chinese immigrants who'd come to California during the gold rush and stayed to build the railroads. Henry was quiet, spoke only when he had something worth saying, but his silence was companionable rather than cold. He had a younger brother fighting somewhere with the infantry, and sometimes at night, James would see Henry staring out at the darkness and knew he was wondering if his brother was looking at the same stars. These men became James's world, more real to him than the family back in Alabama who felt like characters from a story he'd once read. They knew things about each other that no one else would ever know. What each man looked like at his worst, what he sounded like when he was truly afraid, what demons visited him in dreams.
They knew, for instance, that Eddie talked in his sleep, full conversations with people who weren't there, that Rabid would sometimes wake up gasping, convinced he was buried alive, that Gene would stare at his hands after a firefight, turning them over and over as if checking they were still his, that Henry never ate all his rations, always saved a little bit, a habit from childhood poverty that no amount of army provisions could break. And James knew they knew things about him, too. Knew he wrote letters home that he sometimes didn't mail, just folded up and kept in his pack. Knew he checked his shotgun compulsively, cycling the action 3 times every morning before stand-to, a ritual that had no practical purpose but felt necessary anyway. Knew that he kept that photograph from home but never looked at it where others could see, as if his family was something too precious or too painful to share. The days in the trenches developed their own terrible routine. 4 days in the front line, 4 days in support trenches behind the front, 4 days in reserve even further back, then the cycle repeated. In the front line, every moment was tension, waiting for artillery, waiting for raids, waiting for gas. In support, you caught up on sleep and tried to remember what it felt like to not be actively waiting to die. In reserve, you almost felt human again, could write letters and play cards and pretend you were something other than a weapon waiting to be used. James learned to find small moments of grace in the horror. The way frost made the sandbags beautiful in the early morning light, transformed them into something almost crystalline before the sun burned it away. The taste of real coffee when the supply lines were functioning properly, not the chicory mixed swill they usually got. The sound of Eddie humming opera. He'd never been to an opera, had only heard recordings, but he could carry a tune, and the foreign words somehow made the trench feel less claustrophobic. He learned to identify the artillery shells by sound, the freight train roar of the big ones that gave you time to take cover, the whisper of the smaller ones that killed you before you knew they were coming. He learned the smell of different types of gas and which masks work for which. He learned to sleep through anything except the specific tone that meant danger to his sector of trench.